Welcome to our last event in the series on big data and artificial intelligence, the promise and the peril. We have been looking at different ways in which algorithms, data, and these big concepts that we're hearing a lot about in the news and encountering more and more in our everyday lives, both hold great promise for the future, and also there's lots of things to worry about. And our speakers have been helping us sort of reimagine a future with this technology that is more positive and better for us. And I appreciate those of you who've been bearing with us this year through multiple reschedulings and cancellations and rain and weather. Weather's not been with us this year, but still we've had some great events, and tonight's event is no exception to that. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Ed Finn, as you can see, from the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University, which is really great center. They're doing lots of interesting work. I recommend you look them up. I'm particularly excited about all the work that they do with speculative fiction and science fiction, and using that as a tool to think about and imagine the future of science and society and a variety of issues related to also policy and what kind of world we're going to live in. Dr. Finn is also a professor in the School of Arts, Media, and Engineering and in the Department of English. And he's the author of the book, What Algorithms Want, Imagination in the Age of Computing. And as you can see, he's going to talk to us tonight about the algorithmic imagination. So please welcome Dr. Ed Finn.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thank you so much to the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology, and to all of you for joining us on an inclement evening. It's nice to be here. Rain is like really exciting for people who live in Phoenix, so just been all delighted all day. I'd like to talk about algorithms tonight because I think that this is a really useful and underappreciated word when it comes to our relationship with computers, our relationship with computation, and these questions of big data and thinking machines, artificial intelligence. It all starts with the algorithm, which is a humbler word. It's a word that you see people throw around in all sorts of contexts. And when I started working on my book on the subject, I realized that there was a very productive ambiguity there, that people use this word as a kind of rug that they can sweep all sorts of things underneath. And that got me interested, that this word has become a kind of pack mule that carries all sorts of goods and contraband across the divide. And the divide is the gap between the things that we wish computers did and the things that computers actually do. So I don't think I need to make the case for why this is important. I mean, how many of you are physically touching a computer of some kind right now? A smartphone, or a laptop, or a smart watch, or a smart necklace, a smart ring. These things are starting to pop up and percolate up. So our relationship with computation has not just become more complicated, it's become more intimate. Computers used to be things that were locked away in rooms that only the high priests were allowed to enter. And then they arrived on our desks, and then they got into our laps. Now they're in our pants. You can see where this is going. And that intimacy is not just about physical contact, but it's about the different kinds of relationships you have with a device that knows how fast your heart is beating, or what time you wake up in the morning, or that is listening to things that are said, not just when you're speaking to your device, but just when you're speaking to other people. So that is a new kind of computation, a new imaginary space around computation. And it has different stakes. What I want to argue in this talk is that we're living in the midst of a sea change around these social stakes of computation. And to understand what those stakes are, we have to start with this idea of an algorithm. So I want to start with a little bit of history and context to frame this word. So if you ask an engineer what an algorithm is, they'll tell you something like this. It's a method for solving a problem. It's a recipe. You can have an algorithm for baking a particular kind of cake. You can have an algorithm for rotating your crops. An algorithm doesn't necessarily have anything to do with computers or even with math. I thought this was going to work, but it didn't. To go old school. If you ask a mathematician, there's a quite clear and rigorous mathematical history to the notion of the algorithm that's grounded in something called effective computability. And effective computability is this space of mathematical problems that we can solve in a finite amount of time, that we can know with certainty that are solvable. Because it turns out there are a lot of mathematical problems that you don't know if you'll ever be able to solve. And you can spend a long time trying, and you still might not know whether you're close to a solution or far from a solution. But algorithms operate in a space of problems that are solvable. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, there's another notion of algorithms which approaches the idea of beauty and elegance, that great algorithms, like other great scientific and mathematical expressions, are concise. They demonstrate properties like symmetry or other forms of elegance. And this is a notion that we have about computation that comes into a lot of our social relationships with computers, that we want them to be beautiful in that way. We want them to be like poetry. We think that if we can just cut through all of the complexities and the messiness and the problems, we can come to some sort of essential truth. We can define that truth. We can encode it into a machine, and that machine will then capture the best or the essence of life. So the algorithm is tangled up between all of these definitions, and it's implemented and used and described in all of these different ways in tension with one another. There's also a deep history to the idea of the algorithm. This is a very old piece of clay demonstrating the Pythagorean theorem and an algorithm for finding the square root of 2. The word algorithm is derived from Muhammad ibn al-Khwarizmi, who was an 8th century Persian scholar, astronomer, and mathematician based in Baghdad. And he wrote a treatise, a book on mathematics that was translated into Latin in Europe and was widely circulated and became the standard mathematical textbook for several hundred years afterwards. And from that work, we have both the words algebra and algorithm. And algorithm was simply a Latinization of Al-Khwarizmi's name. When we look farther forward to the way that we talk about algorithms now, there are some who see the question of computability as much higher stakes. So Alan Turing, Alonzo Church, other mathematicians and logicians were wrestling with this question of how can you tell whether you're going to be able to solve a mathematical problem before you start. Working somewhat independently, several of these researchers came up with different proofs of effective computability. And so they identified a set of mathematical questions for which you could know that the solution could be achieved by a human being working with a pencil and paper in a finite amount of time. This is what effective computability meant. And when they figured this out, they were actually quite despondent because the space of mathematical problems that is effectively computable was so small. So much of math was outside of this. So much of math was still in this unknown space where you couldn't know ahead of time. And this research was connected to broader debates about whether you could validate or prove math, whether you could build a sort of logical bedrock for the larger mathematical enterprise. And so that notion of effective computability encodes in it a kind of desire to make more stuff effectively computable. If you think about that space as being small when this research was being done in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, what are things that we now deem effectively computable? Driving cars, trading stocks, hiring and firing people, giving people loans. These are all problems suggesting who you should go on a date with. These are all problems that we now think of, or some people think of as effectively computable. They're tractable by computation. And so there are a few folks like Stephen Wolfram, who is the creator of Wolfram Alpha, which is a search engine, and who's written a book called A New Kind of Science, who argues that this notion of computation and effective computability has powerful parallels in the natural sciences. That, in fact, if you look at any complex system, you're actually looking at a kind of computer. So one of the principles of the Turing machine is that a computer, in principle, can model any other kind of computer. So your iPhone can emulate any other kind of computer, even a giant desktop, or it can emulate the UNIVAC, one of those giant machines they used to keep locked away, and vice versa. A 30-year-old Game Boy could emulate a modern-day iPhone. It would just do it really, really slowly. So what if you extend that principle and you can model the universe? What if you just had enough grant funding and enough supercomputer clusters and you could model every atom on the planet and you could finally predict the weather? What if the human brain is something that you could model? What if the universe itself is a kind of computer? You could think of this as the computationalist ethos, the idea that effective computability is a kind of organizing principle for the structure of all complex systems. Science fiction writers have explored that idea in a number of different guises. One that I find particularly compelling and I use as a way into this topic in my book is from Neal Stephenson's novel Snow Crash. So if you accept this idea that the human brain might also be effectively computable, then maybe you would accept the idea that humans are programmable. In the novel, Stephenson imagines this connection between computation and cognition. If I can read a short excerpt. Remember the first time you learned binary code? Sure. You were forming pathways in your brain, deep structures. Your nerves grow new connections as you use them. The axons split and push their way between the dividing glial cells. Your bioware self-modifies. The software becomes part of the hardware. So now you're vulnerable. All hackers are vulnerable to a namshub. We have to look out for one another. So Stephenson imagines that computer programmers and hackers who have spent the most time thinking in terms of code are now vulnerable to a kind of virus, that they can be linguistically hijacked by the right sequence of ideas, the right sequence of words. And if you think about the relationship we have with computation, we have a lot of anxiety about this notion of machines and minds and where they intersect and where they're different, what the boundaries are between them. So this is the Turing machine. This was the revolutionary conceptual idea that Turing came up with in his proof of effective computability, which was one of the major proofs of concept for the whole idea of the modern computer. This is a magical machine. This isn't a machine you can actually build because it requires an infinite spool of tape. And I don't have one of those. I don't think anyone does. It's a thought experiment, but it's incredibly elegant and powerful. And this simple machine, which just moves back and forth along this infinite spool of tape, making marks and erasing marks, is, according to Turing's proof, also something you could use to emulate an iPhone or a machine from the 1960s. So the algorithm binds up all of these questions about what code is, how it can engage with the world, whether we are abstracting or simplifying complex systems, or whether we're just creating a new kind of computer that's describing the computer of reality. Algorithms end up becoming the direct implementation, the expression of all of these ideas. So there's a classic computer science problem, the traveling salesman problem, which asks asks you to figure out what the shortest path would be for somebody who has to visit a randomly sorted group of dots on a grid. So you have a bunch of these scattered dots, and you have to find the shortest path where you go to visit all of them, as if you were a traveling salesman charting a route between all of these different cities. You can write a solution to this. You can write an algorithm to this with a few lines of code. When UPS needs to write an algorithm for directing all of their brown trucks to visit all of the places where they have to drop off packages, they call that algorithm Orion, and apparently when you print it out, it's 1,000 pages long. Because the real world is complicated. It's messy. It's full of stop signs and construction and dogs that might bite and places where you can't make a left turn and varying fuel prices and trucks that might break down, many, many different variables. And I imagine that UPS has to update their algorithm all the time, because that's what algorithms have to deal with. They have to contend with the messiness of reality. So the algorithm that somebody might write in a computer science class that you could print out, on an index card to solve the traveling salesman problem isn't going to work in real life, because there's so many externalities, so many complexities to the real. So this brings us to this question of imagination and the algorithmic imagination, the ways in which we use computers to try and imagine the world, capture the world, describe the world, improve the world, change the world. And so to get into that, I want to take a step back again and just describe a little bit of imagination as a keyword. Where does this come from? So the classic notion of imagination is inspiration. You literally breathe in great ideas. These ideas come from the universe, they come from the gods, they come from beautiful places, they come from nature. Maybe you'll have a muse hanging out with you, telling you what you should write or sing or sculpt. And the key here is that imagination is something that comes from outside of us. It's a sort of supernatural force. It's something that we don't control. It's not so different, really, from the way we think about computation today. The kind of magical power we ascribe to things like the Google search bar. If you look at the things people search in the Google search bar, they search really remarkable stuff. Stuff like, why should I live? Stuff like, what does it mean to fall in love? Stuff that Google doesn't know, but that we somehow want Google to know. We want Google to tell us, maybe would be a better way of putting it. So imagination is something that we are increasingly doing in relationship to computation. Now, there are other models of imagination. Imagination as something that is the domain of the lone genius, or that imagination is something that comes from us, the sort of Renaissance human model where we are the font of creativity. The idea that imagination is something we do together intersubjectively. But increasingly, we look to algorithms as a kind of mirror, or as a sounding board, or sometimes as the source of imaginative thinking. So when we think of imagination now, and especially when you think about it in the context of something like Google, we're talking about it also as a kind of knowledge. Kant talked about the quest for knowledge. Google talks about the quest for knowledge. And imagination is a way of extending our minds. Imagination is the way we come up with new words, new ideas, new stories. And these are the things we use fundamentally to create new stuff, to advance the structures of knowledge, to advance the horizons of our thought, the things we are even capable of thinking. If we don't have the words to describe new stuff, it's really, really hard to think about that stuff. And when we do have those words, all of a sudden those things become much more concrete, much more powerful. So as we, and meanwhile, of course, the actual quantity of information, the quantity of facts, the quantity of statistics, the quantity of data that we're generating is increasing exponentially, and so we are more and more dependent on algorithms to help us filter it and search through it. And so again, we become tempted to engage in this relationship with knowledge that moves beyond rationality. It's easier, in a way, to believe in algorithmic systems than it is to rationally engage with them, to rationally trust them. We can't help but tell stories about the systems. We can't help but anthropomorphize and imbue things with magic. And of course, we bend over backwards to make the magic work even when it doesn't work. We so desperately want these systems to be magical. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a parent be more patient talking to their smartphone than they are talking to their own children, right? Or learn the joke so that you can set Siri up to deliver the punchline for you, right? We really want to believe in the stories that we tell about computation. So I have Denis Diderot up here. He was one of the creators of the original Encyclopédie Française. And I want to draw another connection here around Kant and the idea of the quest for knowledge to the long trajectory of the Enlightenment. Because another thing we're talking about with imagination here is this question of how we know and our desire, our curiosity to understand more about the external universe and also understand more about ourselves. And so this encyclopedia, the first modern encyclopedia, created and attempted to create a structure for all knowledge, all scientific knowledge at the time. And what made it radical was that it put God into its structure instead of saying that God was on top of the structure. Some people say that this was the book that caused the French Revolution. But it was the beginning of this long trajectory of the idea that we could, if we could just get all of the information together and we could, through the process of scientific observation, the scientific method, the correction of errors, we could improve on what we know. Sure, it's going to be full of mistakes, but we'll keep working on it. We'll keep working on it and it will get better. Our imaginations will grow, our powers of observation will grow. Our scientific model of the universe will improve in its fidelity. As we pursue that project now, we increasingly pursue it through algorithms. When you think about what scientific research today means, almost all of it involves looking at a screen at one point or another. Almost all of it involves depending on computational sensors and models and data at one stage or another to interpret results, to do statistical measurements on evidence, certainly to disseminate the results, and to make researchers aware of important results. Just as if you think about the horizon of stuff that you are aware of right now, what percentage of that horizon was filtered by Amazon, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Apple, right? It's not just the things that you're thinking about right now, but the things that you even know exist in the world. The words that you have, right? The books, the music, the movies, the things that exist for you as cultural objects. Many of them are now shaped by algorithmic filters. And so the structure of knowledge is one that increasingly we're relying on algorithms to build for us. The imagination of knowledge is something that is now powered in a lot of important ways by computation. This is a figure from the patent application. It's owned by Stanford University and licensed to Google for, I think, $1 a year or something. This is the patent for PageRank, which was the innovation that led Larry Page and Sergey Brin to create Google and to really redefine our relationship with information on a very broad scale. PageRank was, it looks a little bit like that encyclopedia page, right? It was a model that said, well, we're going to trust information more that other trustworthy sources have linked to. It's a very simple idea. So if you have a reputable website and it points to something, you're going to take that something more seriously than if you had an unreliable website pointing to it. And by doing that on a mass scale, by creating a kind of map of the internet, you can start to see what are the reputable, valuable, useful sources of information. And then when people search for things, you can give those those sites to them. Before this, it was an unsolved problem. It was a messy problem. And so Google went from being an observer and a mapper, a cartographer of the internet in the past couple of decades to being a kind of architect of the internet. Some huge percentage of every single device online, I think when I researched my book, it was something like 60% of all devices on the internet each day talk to Google at least once. Everything. Google is pursuing this quest for knowledge very seriously. Google wants to know all sorts of things about you. Google would like to take care of your email for you and look at your photos and keep track of your contacts. Google is not doing this to be evil, but Google wants to also map out the relationships between all sorts of different known entities. So Knowledge Graph is one of their more recent projects, creating a data set of, I think, billions of different entities like public figures and buildings and places and different kinds of information that are associated with them. This is an enlightenment project. This is a project to construct a larger body of knowledge. Google wants to know everything that it can know. And the role of that knowledge, in an interesting way, is it plays a very complex role in our relationship with computation. I think this old quote from Eric Schmidt is really interesting in that regard, that we really want to know what to do. The answers that we're looking for are not just factual answers, right? They're guidance about the decisions that we make. We're always looking for some kind of higher power, some kind of external objective or thing that we fantasize as objective arbiter. We're looking to outsource our responsibilities. And we're also looking to trust something. So one of the things I find fascinating is not just the questions that we ask, but the ways in which people will use the search bar as a kind of confessional, right? That the queries people put in are not really questions at all. They're just statements. And this is part of the intimacy that we have with computation now. And that means that the algorithms that we're dealing with know us in a very different way, in a very, sometimes a profound way, but also in an incredibly limited way. And I'm sure we've all had this experience of the optimism where you use some service or you pose some question and you think that, after all of this observation and this time you've spent with some service, that the service is going to manifest some brilliant, the perfect show for you to watch or whatever it is, and then it's a total failure. And you realize that the magic isn't quite there yet. But the magic that is there is the magic that we bring to these relationships, the magic that we bring by believing in the narratives of technology that we construct. So I find the Google autocomplete function really fascinating, because if you've probably have seen this happen, where you start typing in a question, and Google doesn't even need you to ask the question anymore. Google can ask the question for you once it gets a sense of where you're going, right? So taking this to this logical extreme, you're not even on the quest for knowledge anymore. You're like riding shotgun while Google's on the quest for knowledge. So autocomplete is really fascinating because it means thousands of other people typed in whatever this thing is before you. But people you'll never see, you'll never know. And so I set my students a constrained creative writing assignment every once in a while, where I'll give them some sort of a seed. I think in this case it was, why should I? And then they can add letters or words to get different kinds of output from autocomplete. And they have to construct a poem or a short story only using the things that autocomplete gives them back. So these are all phrases that thousands of strangers, thousands of intimate strangers typed at one point or another into their keyboards. And I find this really interesting as a new kind of, a little glimpse of one of these spaces of imagination, algorithmic imagination, where we are doing a kind of sharing, a kind of reflection. Sometimes it's a kind of rebellion or a plea for help or a cry of despair or a shout of triumph. We're doing it alone, but together, mediated by the machine. That relationship with the other, with this kind of remote, inscrutable entity, is something that is also familiar from the Romantic tradition. This is the sublime. So if you think about imagination, the taproots of imagination, this notion of imagination being the idea of holding competing ideas in your mind at the same time, the idea of engaging with the infinite, with the impossible, with the extreme, with the unknowable, is something that William Wordsworth and other romantics considered a mental faculty, something that moved between memory and experiential interpretation and projection. It was about the sublime, but not just the Kantian sublime, right? Also a natural sublime, a sublime that that could be approached in many different ways through different kinds of transcendental experiences. And I think today, what you would think of as the natural sublime celebrated in this famous painting has been replaced by a kind of algorithmic sublime. It's one that's dictated on this vastness that we can just see the edges of, the vastness of the computational ocean. This is just an image from the popular game Red Dead Redemption 2. Why would people buy this game to experience this sort of potted version of serene and sublime nature instead of like actually going out to serene and sublime nature? Because the algorithmic version of it is more compelling somehow. It's easier, it's more accessible, it's very fakeness in a way, makes it more fun. You don't have to drive 5 hours and find a parking spot. You can just turn it on your screen, and it's always waiting for you. And then finally, this word imagination opens us up to new kinds of juxtapositions and breaking points. And I'm really interested in the ways in which algorithms and algorithmic imagination can go beyond the things that we traditionally thought of as possible. So this is Google's Deep Dream algorithm, which was originally designed to visualize the effects of machine learning iterations. So taking little instructions to say find an edge and enhance it, or look for something that looks like an eye and make it look a little bit more like an eye. So you tell it to look for something like an eye, and you do that a few million times in a photograph, and all of a sudden it finds a lot of eyes. And it does something that I think humans don't do. It creates something that feels almost like a new aesthetic. There's an art of disjuncture here, in the obsessive repetitiveness, the narrative, the fractal nature of it, is something that felt new when it first arrived on the scene. And one of the things that I think we see in algorithmic imagination is, or we look for, is this capacity to surprise us. And I think that Deep Dream was one of those things that surprised us. Um, Computers aren't that good at surprising us because they're always modeling on past data. Their strength is in seeing the past in a deeper and richer way than we could. And so when they do surprise us, it really freaks us out. There's a wonderful moment of this described in Nate Silver's book, The Signal and the Noise, when Gary Kasparov was playing IBM's Deep Blue computer in 1997. This was a big moment in this larger question of algorithmic imagination and humanity and machines, because the world's reigning chess champion lost for the first time. For the first time, chess fell away as a territory that we considered a space of human primacy, agency, imaginative play. And all of a sudden, and as soon as that happened, we started saying things like, well, chess was never really, chess was just kind of this numbers game. As soon as humans are no longer the best at it, it doesn't no longer, it no longer counts as intelligence or imagination if a machine can do it. So in the 44th move of the first game, Kasparov is playing, and IBM, the Deep Blue makes a move that really surprises Kasparov. It's something that seems really random. I think it was a little pawn move, and Kasparov couldn't stop thinking about it, and he became convinced that this was a sign that the chess program, which up till that point he had seen as a somewhat predictable operator, as a machine that had a kind of aesthetic or a style that he understood, he thought this move was a sign of some kind of deeper intent, some sort of deeper level of strategy and play. And he couldn't stop thinking about it. It really disturbed him because he thought he knew where he stood with Deep Blue. And all of a sudden, this thing came out of left field and threw him off his game. After that game, his anxiety over the move started to throw off the rest of his play, and it ended up leading him to lose the series of matches. And what's interesting about this is that only many, many years later did it emerge that the move was a bug. The move was the IBM's machine had this failure condition where if it got stuck in some sort of a loop and it didn't know what to do, it would just pick a move at random. And so it was a random move. And after that happened, the IBM engineers sort of recognized it when it happened, and then they silently corrected it that night and didn't say anything about it. Just went on with the rest of the matches. And this is a classic example of something that we do all the time, right? We see a computer do something weird, and we ascribe all sorts of meaning and agency to it. We're imaginative, storytelling, pattern-seeking animals. We can't help but do this. We can't help but construct these narratives. And so our imaginative capacity is constantly at odds with a very different kind of imagination that something like Deep Blue performs. So this idea of surprise, of disjunction, opens up this interesting space of imagination as a set of practices. I think it's really interesting that Kasparov, after working through his frustration at losing to what I think he called a $10 million toaster at the time, now embraces the idea of chess with computers and talks about what he calls advanced chess, where humans and machines play together. So the best human-machine combinations are better than the best machines. They're better than the best humans too, though that's less surprising. And so these human-machine combinations, some people call them centaurs. This is a really interesting area. This is the question of what can you do when you pair human imagination, computational imagination, and find ways to collaborate with the algorithm. I think we have a set of different interesting practices and methods and techniques for imagination in the human creative toolbox already. And we haven't done very much yet to explore how those things intersect with the kinds of surprise and disjuncture that machines can offer. And I think that you can open that up to explore the question of not just thinking with machines, because we already think with machines. You don't remember your best friend's phone number anymore. Some of you might not even remember your own phone number anymore because your phone remembers it for you. Uh, you you've outsourced a lot of memory and certain kinds of cognition to machines already. But what if we start to think about imagination in that way too? What if we're sharing our imagination with our machines? When Facebook pops up a memory for you, is that an imaginative act as well as a memory act? So I think that one of the really interesting ways that we can get at this and explore this question of the algorithm and imagination is actually to think about it in terms of time, the experience of temporality. So uh, a rule of thumb from interface design is that you want to make sure that your website or your system responds at around the same speed that it takes the central nervous system to register a response reaction. Usually somewhere around 0.1 or 0.2 seconds, 1 or 200 milliseconds. Um, so if you can design a system that reacts that quickly, it feels instantaneous to us, right? That feels really fast, and we all like it when it's really fast. If any of you remember the era of dial-up internet, did not feel that fast, and it was very frustrating. But of course, what feels really fast to us is in fact really slow for the machine. 1 or 200 milliseconds is a really long time in computational temporality. Most places on Earth are less than 400 milliseconds away from internet response, and that's using that's relying on satellite internet. Most places are much faster than that. The latency, the response time, is often under 100 milliseconds. Google has strategically positioned its infrastructure around the globe so that most places are less than 100 milliseconds from a response from a Google server. But of course, that is also pretty slow compared to how fast computers really are, right? Computers operate, the clock speeds of machines run in microseconds. GPS satellites, because they're orbiting the Earth, are not just calculating position, they're also calculating the time. And their timestamps that they offer to your phones, to the millions and millions of different devices using the global positioning system, they're so finely calibrated that they have to account for the relativistic speed, the fact that they're orbiting the Earth faster than we are standing on the surface of the Earth. Well, they're actually orbiting, they're traveling around at the same speed, but there are still relativistic gravitational forces at work that they have to account for in the math because they're operating at this incredibly fine-grained scale of time. And so time, in that sense, when we construct these systems, we're almost building time machines. You know, we write the code, we construct a system at human scale, but then we send it off into the temporal plane of the microsecond or the millisecond, and we can't access it anymore. You know, this thing that we built to trade stocks or to interrupt, you know, some sort of circuit, or to do something to function as a medical device, or to regulate our heartbeat, whatever this thing is, it's doing it at that scale of microseconds and milliseconds, and no human is going to be able to interrupt it quickly enough to stop it from doing whatever it's doing. We've built the time machine, we've sent it off, and we can reel it back in, right? We can bring it back to the level of human time and try and figure out what happened if it went wrong or if it broke. But we can't participate meaningfully in the decisions that are happening at that faster scale. And so we love the immediate gratification of those rapid responses, this idea of reflexive computing that feels like an extension of our own mind or our own body, that our embodied will gets reflected in these instantaneous responses from these systems. But that fast thinking for us, which is kind of reactive, often emotional, feels like it's our embodied self, extending its tentacles out into the world. Have any of you ever had phantom cell phone syndrome, where you think your pocket is ringing, but it's not really ringing? Your phone is like this extended part of your body now. But for the machine, this fast, what we think of as really being really fast, is incredibly slow. And the machine has all of this time, and it will increasingly have time to study our reactions. Just like CAPTCHAs now, those things to see, where you click, I am not a robot, that's all about the speed, the microsecond scale speed of the way your mouse moves and the way that you click that button. Because what feels fast for us is, a long tapestry for computation. And so there's this huge mismatch of styles of cognition. So I want to close by talking a little bit about what role the humanities can play, what role humans can play in this time of machines. One is the idea of algorithmic literacy and starting to think about these systems as not just oracular or magical, but as being technological constructs that have insides and outsides. One of the remarkable things is that we're so desperate to believe in these black boxes that we keep pretending that there aren't lots and lots of humans in there. Came out recently that Amazon has hired thousands of people to listen to Alexa recordings to improve the effectiveness of the machine learning that they're doing to answer people's questions. So you think of Alexa as this robot that you're talking to, but it might well be that there's actually a human there listening in to actually make the robot work better. And there are a lot of AI products out there that actually have a lot of humans under the hood making the AI work better. So starting to see into the black box to demand some transparency and access into the way that things are working is really important. That extends to understanding the fundamentals of how computers work more generally, the failure modes, the difference between sampling a bunch of discrete data points and building a model out of that, and experiencing a more continuous, complicated, rich version of reality. Another thing that I've tried to do at the Center for Science of the Imagination and other people do is to build new kinds of feedback loops and tell new kinds of stories about computation. These don't always have to obviously be about computers. This is a question we're dealing with in other arenas too, like synthetic biology and the intermingling points like artificial intelligence and different forms of intelligence. We did a new edition of Frankenstein that explores these questions through that great text. But we've also done projects like a NASA research project on the near future of space exploration. And several of those stories ended up being about AI because anytime you're thinking about the future, you're also talking about the future of computation. And also things like our annual competition around climate change and climate fiction, which gets hundreds of entries from young people around the world. There are also more direct ways that we can start to stage these conversations. I find science fiction to be a really powerful way to imagine, as Matt said in his very kind introduction, different speculative futures that can be really useful ways to think about what we should do versus what we can do. So this is an event we're going to be hosting in Washington, D.C. next month around what science fiction can tell us about artificial intelligence, and specifically in the context of technology policy now. So not worrying about killer robots and the same few stories we tell about AI all the time, but actually exploring the richer history and archives of our stories about the future to explore what we could glean for the near future, what I might actually be able to anticipate and do better in the next few years. And then finally, I left this as an empty box. How do we work with machines? Kasparov has come up with this idea of centaurs. If you think about the ways in which you work with machines right now, I imagine that you're using machines for all kinds of thinking and memory and cognition, but it's at a pretty basic level. And as we ascribe more agency to different systems, how could we start to collaborate in more interesting ways? How can we develop forms of trust, maybe, that are not there now, that go both ways, right? Where the systems trust their users and protect their users, and the users also trust the systems. It's not, and where it's not an adversarial or just a sort of consumer product model. I think that this question of the algorithmic imagination is a really important one. What happens in this box, how we move it from a black box to a visible box, an editable, changeable box, is going to be one of the most important questions we wrestle with over the next couple of decades as individuals and as societies. If you think about the role of civic engagement, of fake news and information, of replication in the sciences, of the ways in which we connect to other humans, the imaginative faculty of empathy, because empathy is also a form of imagination. You have to be able to imagine how other people feel and how other people live if you want to be a social human being. All of these things are being inflected by the algorithm in really powerful ways. And too often we're just looking at the symptoms or the immediate problems of our relationship with computation, and we're not thinking about these deeper systemic challenges and systemic opportunities. Thank you very much.
We have plenty of time for Q&A, but to get your questions on the recording, Magda's going to come around with a microphone. So just raise your hand. She'll come around and just wait for the microphone to get to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Finn, for your presentation. I have a question about the connection between imagination, inspiration, and the quest for knowledge, and about the quest of knowledge for what is outside and inside ourselves. So you described the relationship between imagination and inspiration, and you addressed how inspiration can be considered as something that comes from outside. And in this perspective, you connected imagination with Google and computation. And at the same time, you addressed imagination as connected with a quest, a research for knowledge, and as a double movement, both in the direction of outside ourselves and in the direction of inside ourselves. So about this second aspect, the inside ourselves, so the quest for knowledge about what is inside ourselves and the inspiration that comes from, for example, our inner life, our memories, and what we can define as the intimate and psychological dimension of the person. So my question is, how would you suggest us to understand the relation between algorithm and imagination in relation to the inside?
That's a great question. So there are some very straightforward ways people have started to do this. If you look at the quantified self movement and the fact that companies like Apple and Google are developing all of these devices that track your biological state, your sleep patterns and your heartbeat and different kinds of biomedical feedback. Why are people interested in that? Because they want to know more about themselves, and they want to know more about themselves in a way that is not consciously accessible. We're really bad at understanding a lot of our biophysical signals. Some people learn how to do things like moderate their heart rate, or can sort of consciously engage with some of these deeper biological systems that are not usually accessible from the conscious mind. Most of us can't do that. And so the things that computers can count, computers are much better at counting these sort of long-range patterns than we are. So a computer is much better at identifying what time you typically leave for work every morning, or how long it takes you to walk there, or at what time of day you get sleepy. Computers are better at this sort of longitudinal tracking, and also provide ways to multiply that across many different people. So if you imagine the future of healthcare, and if many people consented to this kind of monitoring, you might be able to see patterns of heart disease or different kinds of illness in a different way. I think in terms of imagination, though, we're just at the beginning of what might be really interesting observations around that. I'm really interested in this question of practices and methods. If you think about imaginative people, how have they learned to do it? Why are there some people who can show up in front of a room and perform improvisational poetry or song or music? Why are there people who can, show up in front of a chalkboard and start to do really complex imaginative math, and that this is something that can sort of turn on or turn off? We all have this fundamental imaginative capacity, but we don't really know how to count it or how to access it. And I think there are interesting ways in which computation can start to open that door by showing us behaviors and patterns that we couldn't otherwise see. Now, the hazard there is that we love looking for patterns, and we'll find these patterns whether they are meaningful or not, whether they even exist or not. And the thing that my watch might tell me about how I sleep is a story about how I sleep, but I might have a different story that is informed by lots of information that the watch never captured. So the things that the watch can know and the things that I can know are very different. And so it's in the meeting between those different sort of constructs or models of self, memory, identity, that I think interesting things can happen in terms of imagination.
So it's really interesting that you gave this presentation in this exact room, this exact building, because it is the computer science building, and this is like the main purpose of the computer science school. So my question would be, from the perspective of somebody or engineer or computer scientist who understands how a machine necessarily works, or understands necessarily how a black box works, the underpinnings of an Alexa, that natural language processing abilities. How does the relationship with technology change when you're the one developing it, or when you're the person, building the hardware? And how does that affect the capacity for the imagination between the individuals who are creating these things? And, how is it different from that and some of this that you're saying, the underpinnings, the code, how it works?
The seduction that I talked about, effective computability, is this really compelling idea, and we want to make more things effectively computable, is something that you see play out in the way that we think about computational space today. So programming languages are procedural declarative languages. When you write it, it becomes true, right? It exists. Sometimes there's a bug and you wrote something that surprises you because the computer has interpreted what you did in a different way than you did. But for the most part, you have this incredible power, this magical power to summon ideas into existence. And so that's an intoxicating thing, right? Because you can make anything. But the trick is you can only make it in computational space. And as soon as you start trying to engage with the real world, you run up against the limits, the error, the sampling and error rates of the sensors that you're using, and the fact that your users are not your ideal users. One really interesting idea I've heard about is that we've unintentionally engineered many of our systems for a kind of fragility and brittleness, because we keep imagining that everybody's going to be, really nice and use these things the way that we wanted them to use them. And there many news stories about this kind of thing. You know, you can put a few stickers down on a road and trick a Tesla and autopilot into swerving into oncoming traffic, because the systems were not really designed and rigorously tested against that kind of deliberate adversarial data, right? And so there's not a lot of resilience to a lot of these systems. And so we need engineers and computer scientists to have imagination too, and not just be imaginative in the computational space or imaginative in terms of things like optimization and efficiency, which they're already great at, but imagining the social consequences. You know, I think one of the stories, the big stories of the past few years in the algorithmic imagination has been Facebook realizing that it wasn't just a technology company that could move fast and break things, and that growth, you know, the objective of growth, you know, could be pursued without worrying too much about anything else. Now, a billion people, I don't know, you know, a significant fraction of the world's population uses Facebook, and they're like the dog that caught the bus. You know, they create their own weather, they create their own political movements, and so their technology is not just a product anymore. It comes with social and moral dimensions that are really significant, and comes with serious responsibilities. So that's a kind of imaginative practice. With our Frankenstein book, one of the sort of organizing principle of it is scientific creativity and responsibility. And I really like putting those words together, because anytime you're being creative, you need to be thinking about taking responsibility for what you make. So that applies to artists and to engineers and to scientists. And it's that larger taking of responsibility for your work that I think we want to see engineers do. And we see this, nobody wants to take responsibility, right? And that's what we see with a lot of the Facebook story. And so the answer can't be, you're responsible. The answer has to be that we're all responsible, and we all have to participate, and we all have to, complain and advocate and educate and share.
Okay, Ed. Not quite sure how to phrase this question. I find part of your narrative too anthropocentric. For my sins, I wrote an article on the sublime in art and science and tried to break the problem down. And one of the problems was unknowables, right? So you've taught about computables. But as you know, in physics, you cannot know what's going on inside a black hole. So it's not even a question of computability. It's just a fundamentally, we think, unknowable. So how do you bring other kinds of things into the discussion? In quantum mechanics, you cannot know the position and the speed of an electron at the same time. So there are things that we think are fundamentally unknowable, and neither machines nor AI nor us will ever be able to imagine what's going on inside a black hole.
So it's a great question, and now I want to go read your article. I think one answer is that we have to recognize the hubris of the quest for knowledge, right? That this idea that we can know everything is a romantic quest in its way. It's an anthropocentric quest, of course. And then I do think that computation and human modes of knowing can be different. And I think quantum computing is a really interesting example where a quantum computing system could conceivably know a problem in a different way than a human could. But you can, even if you just think about the way that a system like Siri understands human language now, which is just as this giant probabilistic cloud, Siri doesn't know what nouns and verbs are really. It just knows about the likely sequence of words and what's going to come after, what word is going to come next. That's a very different way of understanding language than we think we understand language as humans. But it approaches, it's a way of knowing something that feels more like the relativistic model of physics, right? The probabilistic model of physics. But I think you're quite right that there are things that cannot be known, and one of the moral hazards of the computationalist model, the effective computability model, is we don't need it takes the sort of Einsteinian relativistic or quantum model of physics to this end that says, well, we don't need to know for sure, we just need to know to X degree of fidelity, and we can use our model to become 99% accurate, and that'll be good enough to make all sorts of decisions. And that becomes a moral hazard because the map is never the same as the territory.
Could you point the microphone more at your mouth? Because I think it's not registering.
Oh. I take a darker view, I think, of some of the things that you just presented. As an example, Kasparov and the chess, augmenting his knowledge of chess with, say, Deep Blue or some of these other machines. Shoshana Zuboff wrote a book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. You're talking about or emphasizing the optimistic side of these machine interfaces with humanity. And it's for the benefit, in your view. Sometimes it may be, as for a capitalistic point of view, maybe to manipulate the choices that you make. So you're being guided, not being augmented. Any comments on that?
Absolutely. And I would be the first to say that we need to be wary of the deals that we are making with these companies and recognize that we're not just getting free stuff, we're giving away important things. Sometimes we're trading freedoms, maybe not wholesale, but by degrees, when we use these different systems. My fundamental position, though, is that we can't unring the bell of computation, and we have to deal with the world as it is, and we have to navigate our way to a better future. Now, I don't think that future necessarily needs to involve the funneling of vast quantities of human wealth to a tiny group of people in Silicon Valley. I think there might be other ways to organize the system. There's no reason that these platforms have to be organized around advertising revenue and maximizing certain kinds of behavior and attention for profit. They could be organized in very different ways. And in fact, when the internet was created, it was successful because it was built on a decentralized, non-commercial model. And that was part of what made it trustworthy and shareable. And so I think we need to articulate the better paths forward. And so I'm very sympathetic to Zuboff's critique, but I think we have to also articulate the things we want and not just complain about the things that we don't want. And she may do that. I don't want to imply that she doesn't offer any of those ideas. But I think that taking that constructive position is really hard. It's really hard to actually articulate a compelling vision of what we should be working towards. It's much easier to stand in judgment of all the things that are terrible. So don't take my optimism for a sunny, everything's going to be fine approach. I think it's going to be really hard. But I think that there's no other option but to struggle through.
I have a question. It seems to me like another issue that people have been expressing a lot of pessimism about fairly recently is this issue of algorithmic bias. It seems to me like some of the things about collaboration and imagination that you're thinking about might have resources in them to help address that problem. I wonder if you've thought about ways through that issue.
Yeah, I think this is a really exciting area. If you think about collaboration and actually working with machines, part of it is transparency and starting to see how systems operate and what assumptions went into the making of those systems and who was involved, who was in the room. These are all ways in which Different kinds of bias can unintentionally be introduced into systems. So that notion of transparency is really important. But then when you start thinking about collaboration, that means in part that you can take feedback and you can adjust the system as you go. One of the interesting challenges with a lot of the cutting edge machine learning that we're developing right now is that it's all organized around giving the system a set of examples of what you want it to do. So you've come up with a training set of answers. You say, figure out how to get to these answers. And the machine figures out how to get to those answers, but you don't know how the machine does it. And it's not often, it's often very difficult to make corrections without sort of doing a lot of retraining. You can't go in and tweak a knob, as it were, or it's much harder to do that. Google Photos was embroiled in scandal several years ago because they had developed a tag searching feature so you could search for words. You can still do this. You can search for words in Google Photos and it will pop up images. So if you search, and the scandal was if you search for gorilla, it would sometimes pop up images of African Americans. Google was horrified, everybody was outraged, and I'm not sure, I haven't checked this, but I think for several years, possibly still to this day, you just couldn't search for the word gorillas because it was too hard to actually figure out how you retrain that data. And that speaks to the complexities of machine learning systems that increasingly we think that they work or we think we know that they work. We don't know how they work. And this is going to get really interesting as we start to do more and more science with computational systems. There have already been examples of applications of algorithms to solve different kinds of mathematical problems or to create proofs. And sometimes we'll get something that we can test and validate as a correct answer, but we don't have the insight to understand why it's correct. And that's a scary place to be.
Right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Fenn.